They threw her out into the rain with nothing but the dress on her back. No coat, no cash, no dignity. Margaret Hartwell, the immovable matriarch of the Hartwell family of Charleston, stood on the veranda of Windmere Estate, arms folded, watching her daughter-in-law shiver at the bottom of the porch steps. Even Carter, Vivian's own husband, turned away. He had chosen his inheritance over his wife without a single word of protest. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally cut loose the quiet, bookish nobody who had wandered into their world and outstayed her welcome. But they made one fatal, catastrophic error. They never checked the land deed. And they had absolutely no idea that the woman shivering on that gravel driveway was holding a document that predated the Hartwell family by 2 generations. A document with the power to put every one of them on the street. By morning, the Hartwells wouldn't just be regretting their cruelty. They would be begging for mercy from the only woman in the state of South Carolina who could save them from total ruin. This is the story of the Windmere eviction. Windmere Estate sits on the banks of the Ashley River like a man who has never been told no. It's an antebellum giant, Greek revival columns, a quarter-mile of live oak draped in Spanish moss, and the kind of silence that money buys and insecurity maintains. It smells of beeswax, old bourbon, and judgment. For 3 years, Vivian Voss Hartwell had lived there. Or rather, I survived there. Vivian was a rare books archivist. That's what her employment record said. She was quiet, methodical, and possessed an elegance that didn't announce itself. The kind you can't buy in a showroom, which was precisely the kind the Hartwells couldn't stand. She had met Carter Hartwell at a charity auction in Savannah. He was effortlessly charming in the slightly soft way of men who have never been told no, heir to the Hartwell Maritime Group, which moved cargo through southeastern ports, and was worth at the time a great deal more than it was now. Carter had fallen hard for Vivian's stillness. He said she was the only real thing he'd ever encountered. His mother saw things differently. Margaret Hartwell was a woman who wore kindness the way a fencer wears a mask, as protection, not warmth. She had opinions about bloodlines, social standing, and net worth that she delivered with the serene confidence of someone announcing the weather. Anyone south of a $12 million personal valuation existed, in Margaret's cosmology, as a different category of being entirely. "She's a stray, Carter," Margaret had said at their engagement dinner, not whispering, not even bothering to lower her voice. "A sweet little stray from Beaufort, who stumbled into a very nice yard. What exactly does she bring to a family like ours?" "She makes me happy, Mom. Happiness is a mood, not a legacy. We require more than a mood." From the moment Vivian moved into Windmere, it was a slow, elegant war. And Margaret and her daughter Diana, a woman who spent more energy on her social media presence than on her 2 children, made it their quiet mission to remind Vivian, daily and in small ways, that she did not belong. They'd reassign her seat at formal dinners to the far end of the table, next to Edward's hard-of-hearing college roommate. They'd schedule events on days Vivian had mentioned having plans. Diana would discuss investment portfolios and renovation budgets in the sharp shorthand of old money wate, the kind of code that excludes by design. Vivian listened, Vivian watched, and Vivian said very little. She had learned early that in a house where cruelty wears pearls and a smile, the worst thing you can do is react. The real trouble arrived on a Thursday in October. The Hartwell Maritime Group was bleeding. Had a series of bad bets on Gulfport expansion, a regulatory dispute, and a long-overdue reckoning with Edwards' management decisions had left the company desperately short on liquid capital. They needed a deal. Fast. Dinner that night had the texture of a business meeting with worse food. "We need Calvert Logistics to sign off on the Port Royal Access Agreement," Edward muttered, dragging his fork across his plate. "Without that deal, we're down 7 figures before the new year." "Can't we just buy the access rights outright?" Diana asked, scrolling under the table with the dedication of someone defusing a bomb. "The rights aren't for sale. They're held inside a private trust. Old coastal family. The kind that doesn't return calls. They haven't needed to." Vivian looked up from her soup. "Have you tried writing a personal letter?" An actual letter, not a legal filing. Sometimes a direct appeal from one person to another opens a door that a team of attorneys can't." The table went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when someone has said something both obvious and unwelcome. Diana tilted her head with a half-smile. "Oh, that is precious. Our little archivist thinks a handwritten note is going to move a port access deal." "She's not wrong that charm has its uses," Carter offered weakly. "Charm is for people who don't have leverage," Margaret said, her voice carrying the warmth of a closing argument. "The trust that controls those rights is managed by a firm called Beaumont and Associates. Those men don't read personal correspondence from people they haven't vetted." She set down her fork. "Now, Carter, how about Vivian's household account? I've been looking at the numbers. We need to reduce discretionary spending across the board. I think $900 a month is perfectly reasonable for her books and personal expenses." Carter looked at his plate. "Mom, that's our money." "It's family money, Carter. And until Vivian contributes something beyond being decorative and quiet, she is an expense. A manageable one, but an expense." Vivian felt the familiar burn of humiliation climb her throat. She looked at Carter, waiting for him to push back, to say one word on her behalf, to demonstrate that he was capable of being a man in this house and not just another piece of furniture Margaret had selected. Carter cut a piece of bread and ate it. He said nothing. That was the moment the clock started ticking. Vivian understood then, clearly, finally, that Carter wasn't just soft. He was complicit. And in the Hartwell house, if you weren't holding the whip, you were the one being broken. 2 weeks later, the estate shifted from hostile to actively dangerous. It was the night of the Hartwell autumn reception. A tradition Margaret had established 22 years ago as a way to remind Charleston that the Hartwells mattered. The house was full. Business partners, politicians, old money, new money, and the endlessly ambitious middle scraped the champagne from trays and laughed louder than they felt. Vivian wore a vintage ink blue crepe gown she'd bought at an estate sale 4 years before. Simple, understated, quietly perfect. Margaret, ablaze in diamonds, intercepted her near the bar. "You look fine," Margaret said, which was her version of an insult dressed as a compliment. "Though I'd ask you to stay out of the East Wing study tonight. Edward has the Compass Rose out for appraisal. It came back from the conservator last week. We don't need anyone near it." Vivian kept her voice even. "I have no interest in your jewelry, Margaret." "Of course you don't." Margaret smiled. "Enjoy the party, dear. Just quietly." Vivian spent most of the evening on the side veranda, watching the river go dark. The fireflies were out. She held a glass of sparkling water and tried to feel nothing. Around 10:30, the music inside cut off mid-measure. Then Edward Hartwell's voice, which was not a quiet voice under normal circumstances, boomed through the downstairs rooms. "By nobody leaves this house." Vivian walked inside to find a crowd gathering around the grand foyer staircase. Edward stood at the top, his face the color of a boiled beet. "The Compass Rose," he announced, his voice cracking. "It's gone. Someone took it from the study." The Compass Rose brooch, a 19th century piece of gold and deep rubies shaped like a navigator's star, was the Hartwell Collection's showpiece, appraised the previous spring at $1.8 million. It was the kind of object that existed purely to be shown to people who couldn't have it. Margaret moved through the crowd like a ship in a fog, purposeful, inevitable. Her eyes found Vivian immediately. "Search her," Margaret said, pointing. "Mom, come on!" Carter started. "She was near the east wing. I told her specifically to stay out. I was on the veranda," Vivian said, her voice steady. "For the last hour. Ask the server who brought me water. Ask anyone." "Search her bag," Diana said, and without waiting, she snatched Vivian's small beaded clutch from her hand and upended it over the marble floor. Lipstick, a phone, a card from the Archivists' Union, and then a sound, a metallic clatter, a gasp from the crowd. The compass rose brooch spun and settled in the middle of the floor like an accusation. The room inhaled as one. Vivian stared at it. She had never touched that brooch, had barely looked at it in 3 years of living under the same roof. "Carter." She turned to him. "Carter, you know I didn't do this." Carter looked at the brooch, then at his mother's face, and then at the crowd of people who would remember this moment and repeat it at every dinner party for the next decade. "Vivian," he said, his voice heavy with the particular sadness of a man who had already made his decision. "How could you?" It was a setup, ruthless, efficient, and designed to give Carter grounds for a divorce without a settlement or to collect insurance on the brooch while solving the problem of the inconvenient wife. Possibly both. "Call the police," Edward said. "We will not," Margaret interrupted. The room stilled. "We will not have a scandal in this house. We will handle this privately." She walked to Vivian. Close. "You will leave Windmere tonight. You will sign an annulment agreement acknowledging infidelity and moral conduct issues to avoid the alternative. And you will never use the Hartwell name again." Vivian looked at Carter. He was studying the floor. Something inside her shifted. Not a break, not tears. More like a dam giving way to something much colder and far more powerful than grief. "You want me to leave?" Vivian asked. "I want you gone," Margaret said. "Fine." Vivian smoothed the front of her dress. Her hands were perfectly steady. "But remember tonight, Margaret, you asked for this." Of course it was raining. It was a full-force Carolina downpour, the kind that comes off the river in sheets and turns a gravel drive into a creek. The security guard, not one of her people, one of theirs, opened the front door and waited. Vivian walked to the closet in the entryway and reached for her coat. "That coat was bought on the family account," Diana said, and leaning against the doorframe with a glass of champagne. "You leave with what you came with," Margaret added, "which was nothing of consequence." The guard stepped forward. Not harshly but firmly, the heavy oak door closed behind her. The sound was final, like a courtroom door latching. She was alone on the veranda. It was 11:15 p.m. The nearest town was 6 miles up the river road. The rain soaked through the crepe of her dress in under a minute. She walked down the long oak alley toward the iron gates at the property line, her heels finding every piece of broken gravel, the Spanish moss overhead doing nothing to block the storm. The gates were locked. She climbed the stone wall beside them, tearing the hem of her gown, scraping her knee on the edge. She dropped onto the dark 2-lane road on the other side and stood there, breathing hard. She had her phone. Diana had forgotten to take it. Her hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 attempts to open the keypad. She didn't call a car service. She didn't call a friend. She dialed a number she hadn't used in 11 years. A number her grandfather had given her on the last day she saw him, pressed into her palm with both of his hands wrapped around hers. "Only if there is no other road," he had said. "One ring. Secure line. Identify." The voice was crisp, male, entirely awake despite the hour. "Authorization Voss, Alpha, Coastal 7, Vivian said, her teeth just beginning to chatter. "This is Vivian of the Voss Trust. I'm invoking protocol anchor." A pause. Then the tone on the line changed completely. The bureaucratic flatness gone, replaced by something much more attentive. "Ms. Voss, we weren't aware you were active. Are you in a safe location?" "I've been removed from my residence at Windmere Estate. I'm on the Ashley River Road on foot in the rain. I need extraction, and I need James Beaumont on the phone. Wake him up." "ETA for extraction is 5 minutes. Do not move." She hung up. She stood on the dark road and looked back through the rain at the lights of Windmere, glowing gold and warm through the trees. Inside, the music had resumed. They were celebrating. 4 minutes and 40 seconds later, headlights split the darkness. Not a cab, not a rideshare. 3 black Escalades, moving in tight formation, came around the bend in the river road and stopped directly in front of her. Doors opened before the vehicles fully halted. Men in dark coats moved quickly, efficiently. One held a large umbrella, and another had a long wool coat already unfolded. "Ms. Voss." The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man she recognized as Thomas, head of the Voss family's private security detail, lowered his head and raised the umbrella in one practiced motion. He draped the coat over her shoulders. "I'm sorry for any delay. Are you hurt?" "Cold, Thomas. Take me to the King Street residence." "Yes, ma'am." As she settled into the heated back seat of the middle vehicle, a man in the front passenger seat turned around. James Beaumont. 70 years old, gray at the temples, dressed in a raincoat over what were unmistakably pajamas. He looked disheveled and absolutely furious. "I got the call," James said, pushing a thermos of coffee into her hands. "The Hartwells threw you out." "They framed me for theft first. Carter watched." James's jaw tightened. Then he reached into his briefcase, because of course James Beaumont slept with his briefcase, and pulled out a tablet. He pulled up a file. He scrolled. He stopped. A slow, dangerous smile moved across his face. "They don't know, do they?" James said. It wasn't a question. "Know what, James? They think they own Windmere. They do own it. The Hartwell family has been there for 70 years. They own the house, Vivian, the structure, the columns and the woodwork, and that overpriced kitchen Edward redid in 2019. He turned the tablet to face her. "The land, the 600 acres that Howe sits on, has been under a 99-year private ground lease from the Voss Coastal Trust, your grandfather's trust. Signed in 1926. Managed through my office since 1951. Vivian went very still. "The lease," James continued, his voice very quiet, very certain, "expires this Friday at noon." She looked at the date on the screen. James kept going. "The original deed contains a successor clause. If the lease is not renewed by the direct line heir of the Voss family before expiration, the land and all permanent structures upon it revert to the trust, under your sole authority and control. You don't just have the right to refuse their renewal, Vivienne. You have the right to serve them an eviction notice on your own house." Outside the tinted windows, rain swept across the river and the dark road behind them. The lights of Windmere were gone. "James," Vivian said very softly. "Yes. Prepare the paperwork. I want to hand it to them personally." The convoy accelerated into the night. Inside, the heat was on, the coffee was hot, and the war, the real war, had just begun. And the Hartwells had thrown out the one person who could save them. They simply hadn't known what they were throwing. The morning sun hit the Charleston Peninsula like it had a point to make. Inside the top-floor suite of the Voss family townhouse on Laguerre Street, a federal-style property that had been in the family since 1887 and had never once been photographed for a design magazine because the family saw no reason to show strangers their home. Vivian stood before a full-length mirror. The woman in the reflection was not the woman who had shivered on a river road 6 hours ago. She wore a tailored cream suit. Her hair, which she'd kept in a low bun at Windermere because anything more invited commentary from Margaret, was blown out in long, deliberate waves. She wore no statement jewelry. She didn't need it. "Your schedule—" "Oh, ma'am," Thomas said from the doorway, holding a tablet. "Have the Hartwells made any public statements about last night?" "Nothing official. They've told the household staff that you left voluntarily due to stress. The phrase being used is emotional fragility." Vivian let out a single, dry sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course it is. Margaret wouldn't want her circle to know she shoved a woman into a storm. It lacks the right optics." Back at Windermere, the morning had a different texture entirely. Margaret sat in the sunroom with a cup of Earl Grey and the satisfaction of someone who has just returned their house to its proper order. The storm had passed. The grounds were lush and steaming in the October sun. "Is she completely gone?" Diana asked, walking in with a sheet mask on and a breakfast plate in one hand. "Completely. I had the staff clear her room before breakfast." Margaret spread preserves on a biscuit. "I was thinking we turn that space into a proper dressing room for when you visit. Something with better light." Carter walked in, pale and slightly hollow-looking. "I can't find the folder with the Calvert contract documents. Vivian handled the filing system in the study. Everything's—" "Then hire someone who actually gets paid to file things," Margaret said. "We're not going backward." "I just—" Carter pressed his fingers to his forehead. "Did it have to happen that way? The brooch, the whole thing?" "It was necessary," Edward said, not looking up from his phone. "She was a liability, Carter. And the insurance claim on the brooch is $1.8 million. That shores up the operating shortfall until the Calvert deal closes. It's clean." Just then, the Stevens, the family's elderly house manager, a man who had treated Vivian with a quiet, consistent decency that stood out against everything else in that house, appeared at the doorway with a silver tray. He looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Mr. Hartwell, a courier envelope arrived this morning. Priority delivery, it required a biometric confirmation of receipt." Edward frowned. "Who's it from?" "It bears the seal of the Beaumont and Associates firm, sir. Land Trust Division." Edward relaxed. "The Calvert Access Renewal. We lease some secondary acreage through them. Just routine paperwork." He waved at the envelope. "Probably want their annual fee." He tore it open, scanned it, tossed it onto the table. "There. Notification of lease expiration for the Windermere ground parcel. Expiry Friday at noon." They want a meeting Thursday to discuss asset transition." He shrugged. "Asset transition. That's lawyer language for, we'd like more money. We'll go in Thursday, wave a check for $90,000 and lock it down for another generation." Margaret straightened. "I'll come. I want them to understand who they're dealing with." "The Hartwells don't renegotiate from weakness," Edward agreed. In James Beaumont's corner office on King Street, Vivian was reading the identical letter. "They received it at 9 this morning," James confirmed, setting down his coffee. "Stevens confirmed receipt. Edward opened it himself. And their interpretation? Exactly as expected. They believe it's a routine renewal discussion. Edward told Margaret it was the firm trying to extract a higher fee. Vivian stood at the window, looking down at the palmetto-lined street, morning foot traffic, church steeple in the distance, the unremarkable permanent beauty of a city that has always known how to keep its secrets. "They don't know about the conduct clause," she said. "They most certainly do not." James allowed himself a very small smile. Section 6, Paragraph D of the original 1926 deed. The ground lease may only be renewed by a tenant who demonstrates, and I quote, "moral stewardship of the land and the persons residing upon it in character and conduct befitting the public trust." The persons residing upon it, Vivian, that was you. And by removing me from the property by force, by framing you for theft, and physically expelling you in a storm, they haven't just lost the right to renewal, they've triggered the breach clause, which means I can argue for full asset recovery on the permanent structures as compensation for conduct in violation. She turned from the window. Her eyes were steady. "I don't want their money, James. I want them to sit in your boardroom and realize that the woman they decided wasn't worth protecting is the reason they still have a roof. For now." "Thursday at 10, James said. "I'll have everything ready." "Good." She picked up her bag. "And James, is there any way to control the climate in your waiting room?" He blinked. "The HVAC? Yes, we have full zone control." "Make sure the waiting area runs warm Thursday morning. Margaret Hartwell sweats when she's uncomfortable, and I want her uncomfortable before she even sits down." Thursday arrived gray and close, the way fall mornings in Charleston sometimes do, out like the city is holding its breath. The Hartwell family, Edward, Margaret, and Carter, arrived in their charcoal Bentley at 9:45 and walked into the lobby of Beaumont and Associates with the body language of people who believe they own the room. Margaret wore a St. John jacket and a look that had turned lesser professionals to stone. Edward was in pinstripes. Carter had the face of a man walking toward something he'd decided not to examine too closely. The lobby was intimidating by design. Antique, Charleston, single-house architecture on the outside, marble and mahogany within, and artwork on the walls that the partners had stopped explaining to visitors because the explanations took too long. "Hartwell, we have an appointment with James Beaumont," Edward announced to the receptionist, a young woman in tortoiseshell glasses who did not look up from her screen. "Please have a seat. Mr. Beaumont is in a meeting with the trust's principal." "We are the principals," Margaret said. "You are the tenants." The receptionist finally looked up. She said it the way you state a postal code. "Please sit." They sat. The room was warm. Not uncomfortably warm. Not yet. But by 10:15 it was undeniable. By 10:40, Margaret was discreetly fanning herself with a copy of Architectural Digest. Her foundation was beginning to travel. "This is insulting," she said under her breath. "We need the lease, Mom," Carter muttered. "Shh, just wait." Edward stood, moved toward the heavy interior doors. Before he reached them, both doors swung open, and James Beaumont appeared, cool, unhurried, in a seersucker jacket that had no business looking that expensive. "Edward, so sorry for the delay. The principal took some persuading on your file." He gestured them inside. "What does that mean, persuading?" Edward said. "I have a check right here." He pulled it from his breast pocket. $90,000. That's a generous renewal. We can make this quick." James looked at the check the way you look at a child who has brought a crayon drawing to an art gallery. "Come inside," he said. The conference room was enormous, a table long enough to feel like a statement, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor. At the far end, a high-backed leather chair faced away from them, toward the water. Someone was sitting in it. "Sit down," James said. He did not offer them water. And the Hartwells sat on the near side of the table, the low-status side, which they were too proud to acknowledge and too savvy not to feel. "As you know," James began, opening a leather binder, "the Windmere ground lease expires today. Friday at noon. That is in—" He checked his watch. "Just Ananda, by car, in under 2 hours. Then let's sign it," Margaret said. "I don't know why this requires theater." "There is a complication," James set down his pen. "The Voss Trust has invoked the conduct clause. Section 6, paragraph D. They have received substantive evidence of mismanagement of the property's resident population, abuse of household staff, domestic misconduct, the deliberate endangerment of a person residing on the property." "That is a fabrication," Margaret said sharply. "We run a household of the highest—" "Yes. I actually—" The voice came from the high-backed chair. It was a woman's voice, low, precisely calibrated, terrifyingly familiar. The chair turned slowly. Margaret went white. Edward's pen rolled off the table. Carter made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and stopped breathing. Vivienne sat at the head of the table. She was wearing a deep emerald suit, structured and still, as if it had been built specifically for this room and this moment. On the lapel, pinned with quiet authority, was the compass rose brooch. Rubies catching the gray morning light, each point of the gold star catching it differently. On her right hand, the Voss family signet ring, carved onyx in a heavy gold band that had not been worn in this city in 11 years. She looked at them with the open, uninterested expression of a person who has been waiting a very long time for something predictable to finally happen. "Vivienne," Carter whispered. Why are you—" "Hello, Carter," she said. "You're sitting in my chair." "Your chair." Margaret laughed, a short, nervous sound that was almost nothing like her real laugh. "Is this a performance? Did you—" "You will address the trust's principal with the appropriate courtesy," James said, and his voice had a quality that stopped the room cold. "Vivienne Voss Hartwell is the sole heir to the Voss Coastal Trust, the original grantor, and now the sole authority over the 600 acres on which your house is currently standing. She is your landlord. She has been, technically, since her grandfather passed in 2013. The silence that followed had a physical weight. Margaret's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "She's an archivist." "I am an archivist," Vivienne said, "because I love old things, and because I wanted, just once, to be known as a person, not a trust balance." She looked at Carter directly. The look was not angry. It was something worse. It was complete. "I wanted to know if someone could love Vivienne Voss the woman, not Vivienne Voss the asset." She paused. "I got a very clear answer. Vivienne, listen." Carter pushed back his chair and stood up. "I didn't know. If I had known who you actually were. If you had known I was worth $650 million, you would have treated me better," Vivienne finished. "That is precisely the problem, Carter. That is the only problem that has ever existed in this house." "This is insane," Edward said, his voice climbing. "Fine. You have money? You have a title deed. Wonderful. How much for the lease? Name your number. We'll pay double." Vivienne lifted a document from the table and set it down deliberately. It slid the full length of the table and came to rest perfectly in front of Margaret. The lease is not available for purchase. You have violated the conduct clause, specifically by framing a resident for theft and forcibly removing her from the property during a severe weather event. Vivienne folded her hands. That document is an eviction notice. You have 48 hours to vacate Windermere. Margaret looked at the paper. She looked at it for a long time. We have lived in that house for 30 years, she said. Her voice had lost its polish. My children grew up there. You cannot yet do. Your children grew up on my land, Vivienne said quietly. You rented the view. I'll fight this, Margaret said, and then the room heard it. The first real crack in the voice she'd spent 30 years polishing. I'll hire a dozen attorneys. I'll tell every person in this city. I was hoping you'd say that, Vivienne said. She nodded to James. He pressed a button on the remote at his elbow. The monitor on the side wall came to life. Security footage. High definition. Date stamped the night of the autumn reception. The footage showed the interior of the Windermere East Wing study. It showed Diana Hartwell walking in. It showed Diana opening the antique display case. She knew the catch on the glass. It showed Diana removing the compass rose brooch, slipping it into the pocket of her wrap. The footage cut. New angle. The main hallway, outside the powder room. It showed Diana standing near the side table where Vivienne had set down her clutch during a conversation. It showed Diana's hand, quick and certain, opening the clasp and placing the brooch inside. The room was silent enough to hear the harbor outside. The estate security system uploads to an off-site cloud server every 6 hours, James said pleasantly. The local drive was wiped, apparently by someone with access to the security panel, but the cloud backup was untouched. The off-site server, as it happens, is operated by a firm that is a subsidiary of the Voss Trust. Vivienne stood. She walked slowly around the table until she was standing in front of Margaret. You have 2 choices, she said. Option 1, you vacate Windermere in 48 hours. You leave the furniture, the artwork, the vehicles registered to the estate. You take your personal clothing, and you sign a sealed statement attesting to the events of the reception. I keep it in the Trust's archive. It never goes anywhere as long as it never needs to. She let that settle. Option 2. I release this footage to the Charleston PD and to the press. Diana is charged with grand theft. Edward faces insurance fraud prosecution, because I know the claim was filed Wednesday morning before this meeting. And Margaret, Vivienne leaned slightly forward. You become the woman who framed a trust heir and threw her into a storm. In a city like this, that is a permanent condition. She straightened up. Choose carefully. The clock is running. Margaret looked at the screen. She looked at Edward. Gray. Sweat-sheened, very still. She looked at Carter, as who was crying quietly in the way of men who have never learned to cry properly in small, contained bursts that they can't quite stop. She looked back at Vivienne. For the first time in 30 years of being the most formidable woman in every room she entered, Margaret Hartwell looked like what she was, a tenant who had overstayed her welcome. We'll leave, Edward said, barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Vivienne said. We'll leave, Margaret said, louder, her voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere left to go. Fine, we'll leave. Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted? No, Vivienne said honestly. She turned her back on them. Get out of this office. You're all breathing my air. She did not trust them to leave gracefully, and she was right. 48 hours later, at 8 in the morning, and Vivienne's audit team arrived at Windermere. They found Margaret in the main hallway supervising a maid who was cutting the linings of the guest room drapes, not to save them, but to retrieve the rolled documents she had tucked behind the fabric weights. Vivian walked in wearing jeans and a gray cashmere crew neck, holding a mug of coffee, looking more relaxed than she'd looked in 3 years. "Check the storage benches in the East Parlor," she told the head auditor. Margaret hid the municipal bond certificates in the upholstery, the velvet benches specifically. She had them reupholstered in September. You'll find the seam on the inside back panel. "You have no right to this house," Margaret called from the hallway, her voice raw. "30 years of my life. 30 years of my land," Vivienne called back. She sipped her coffee. Oh, she wasn't unkind about it. She was simply done. Diana was found in the upstairs sitting room attempting to remove a painting from its frame. She had apparently decided the canvas was separable from the Windmere inventory. It was not. Carter came down the grand staircase, carrying a cardboard box. In it, a framed degree, a few photographs, a watch he'd bought himself with money from his first job before the family business swallowed him whole. He stopped when he saw Vivian. She nodded to Thomas, who stepped slightly aside. 2 minutes, Vivian said. Carter set the box down. He had dark circles under his eyes and 3 days of stubble that didn't suit him. He looked like what he was, a man in his 40s who had never been forced to stand fully on his own weight, now discovering what the ground actually felt like. I know I failed you," he said. "Every time she went after you and I said nothing, I know. I knew it then. He stopped. "I kept telling myself it was the path of least resistance, that I was keeping things stable." "You weren't keeping the peace, Carter," Vivienne said. Her voice was even. "You were protecting your inheritance. 3 years of watching your mother humiliate me at your own dinner table, and not once did you put your hand on that table and say enough. Not once." "I loved you. I know that doesn't mean much now, but I did." "I know you did. In the way you were capable of." She tilted her head slightly. "But you loved who I appeared to be. Someone smaller than you. Someone grateful. Someone who made you feel like the big one in the room. The moment I became inconvenient, and the moment I needed you to actually hold the line for me, you chose the easier thing. You always chose the easier thing." "I can change," he said. "I know I can. We could—" "Carter." She said his name quietly, the way you say a word you've decided to stop using. "Go. Go find out who you are when no one's handing you things. That's not a punishment, that's just what needed to happen anyway." Thomas stepped forward. Carter picked up his box. At the front door, he turned back once. He looked at the house, the columns, the alley of oaks, the river visible between the trees in the morning light. He looked at Vivian in the doorway. He looked at all of it for a long moment. The door closed. The locks clicked over. Vivian let out a long, slow breath. "Stevens," she said. The old house manager stepped out of the hallway shadow, and he'd been with Windmere since before the Hartwells arrived. He had always been kind to Vivian, held her umbrella in the rain, remembered that she took her coffee black, never once pretended not to see when something cruel was happening. His eyes were wet, but his posture was perfect. "Yes, Ms. Voss. Open everything, every window, every shutter. Let's get the air moving." She walked toward the staircase, trailing her hand along the banister. "And bring up whatever's best in the cellar. Something older than the lease. I think we've earned it." "To what shall we toast, ma'am?" Vivian paused on the second step. She smiled, and it was the real one, the one that had been living quietly behind all the controlled expressions for 3 years. "To the archivist," she said. She finally found the right document. 6 months is nothing in the life of an old house, but in the life of a city like Charleston, 6 months can rewrite the social record. In the half-year since the Windmere eviction, Vivian Voss had stepped from the shadows of someone else's story into the full light of her own. She had inherited a trust that touched nearly every significant piece of coastal land, from Georgetown to Beaufort. She had hired a management team, restructured 2 long-dormant philanthropic accounts, and established the Voss Literacy Archive, a mobile program that brought rare book collections and reading instruction to rural schools across the Lowcountry. She had been offered board seats on 3 foundations and declined all of them politely, choosing instead to chair one organization she actually believed in. As she had learned, slowly and then quickly, that power held with grace does not need to announce itself. The mouse, the word Margaret had used with such satisfaction, was gone. The woman who had replaced her moved through rooms differently, not louder, just without apology. On the evening of June 14th, the air over Charleston was the thick, fragrant kind that arrives with high summer, jasmine and salt water and the ghost of something older underneath. It was the night of the Carolina Heritage Society annual gala at Drayton Hall. This was not a party. It was an evaluation. Fortunes were confirmed and careers were finished over dinner. Deals were signed on cocktail napkins, and social standing in this city was not assigned. It was ratified publicly by who asked you to dance. Inside the Lagar Street townhouse, Vivian stood before her mirror. She wore a custom gown, midnight velvet, deep blue-green, the color of the harbor at dusk, with thousands of hand-stitched seed crystals along the bodice that caught and released light like the surface of moving water, and at her lapel, pinned exactly where it had been in that conference room 6 months ago, the compass rose brooch, cleaned, reset, reclaimed. It had been a symbol of the Hartwell family's collecting habit, something beautiful, kept behind glass, brought out to impress people. Tonight, it was something else. Tonight, it was a record. "You look like a verdict," James Beaumont said from the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks. "I want to look like something they can't argue with," Vivian said. "You've achieved it. The car is outside. There are photographers at the gate already." She touched the brooch once. "Then let's go." Across town, in a second-floor apartment in North Charleston, the atmosphere was considerably less serene. The ceiling fan wobbled on its mount and barely moved the heavy June air. The kitchen smelled of reheated takeout. Margaret Hartwell stood in a bathroom the size of a closet, applying foundation in the mirror. A shade too pale now, her skin having gone through the particular aging that comes not from time, but from sustained stress. "Edward, where are the silver cufflinks?" she called. "Sold them in April," Edward called back from the bedroom where he was trying to fasten a dress shirt that fit him differently than it had in the years when he had had a personal trainer. "To cover the legal retainer." "Then find something. How we cannot walk in there looking—" "Looking what?" Diana appeared in the kitchen doorway, her voice flat. She had lost most of her social media following in the weeks after the eviction, a slow, public withdrawal of interest that was worse than a single dramatic cancellation. She wasn't coming tonight. We need Beaumont Calvert to see us," Margaret said, her voice clipped. 5 minutes with him at the gala, 5 minutes, and we can get the North Atlantic Consulting contract. That contract is the difference between, she gestured at the apartment, this and something livable. "She'll be there," Carter said quietly. He was at the kitchen table trying to polish a pair of rented dress shoes with inadequate polish and a paper towel. "I'm aware," Margaret said. "Mate, so you're fine walking into the same room as her?" "I don't have a choice, Carter." "You did have a choice," he said. 6 months ago, multiple choices. Margaret stared at him. He looked back at her. He was different now. Something had settled in him, or maybe shifted. He'd gotten a job, a real one, not an inherited title. He was working logistics for a mid-size freight company in Mount Pleasant. He had not told his mother how much it paid. "The Uber's here," Edward called. "Call him back. We'll walk good on the last 200 yards, Margaret said. "We don't arrive in a—" "Mom," Carter said, "it's a regular car. Everyone knows we're not driving a Bentley anymore. We can just get in the car." There was a pause. "Get in the car," he said again, gently, but without room for argument. Margaret picked up her bag and went outside. And the entrance to Drayton Hall was everything the night deserved. Live oaks lit from below, a brick path flanked by low lanterns, the sound of a string quartet floating from the open pavilion. Charleston's most formidable citizens arriving in the warm dark, dressed with the particular confidence of people who have never once questioned whether they belonged here. At 7:40 p.m., a vintage Blacktown car, understated, immaculate, flying the small embroidered pennant of the Voss Trust, came to a stop at the entrance. The door opened. Vivienne stepped out. The crowd near the entrance went quiet in that way crowds do when something they weren't expecting turns out to be exactly as significant as it felt. She walked the lit path with James on her arm, calm, unhurried, at her face wearing the expression of someone who has nothing left to prove and finds that extraordinarily freeing. The brooch caught every light source it passed. Cameras flashed. She acknowledged none of it directly. She didn't need to. She was the room's center of gravity before she crossed the threshold. 20 minutes later, the Hartwells arrived on foot. They had walked the last 200 yards from the parking area, and the June night had done its work. Edward's collar was damp. Margaret's dress, 2 seasons behind, had picked up the fine red dust of the path. At the entrance, a man with a clipboard and a velvet rope looked up. "Hartwell," Edward said. "Edward and Margaret. We should be on the list." The man ran his finger down, flipped the page, came back. "I'm not finding you." "That is absolutely not possible," Margaret said. "Oh, we have attended this event for 19 years. We are legacy donors." "Not this year, ma'am. The list is capacity controlled. Step aside, please. There's a line." "We paid $15,000, Edward said, his voice climbing. "Transferred this morning. It's everything we had accessible." "I handle access, sir, not accounting. If you're not on the list—" "Please." Carter stepped forward. "We just need 5 minutes inside. We're looking for one person. Beaumont Calvert. It's—" "Please. It matters." From the second-floor balcony of the pavilion, Vivienne watched. She held a glass of white wine and watched with the particular attention of someone who has been in the position on the other side of that rope and has not forgotten what it feels like. "Shall I have security move them along?" James asked, standing at her elbow. "No." "Your Grace, don't. If we send them away now, they'll tell themselves it was a computer error. They'll rebuild the story into something they can survive. They'll say they chose not to attend." She took a slow sip. "Let them in. Let them walk through this room and feel what they made me feel for 3 years. That is a far more complete education than the parking lot." She found Thomas with her eyes. A small nod. Thomas touched his earpiece. At the gate below, the man with the clipboard paused, touched his ear, looked confused, then resigned. "All right. Override from the host. Standing room only. No table seating." Margaret nearly wilted with relief. She straightened immediately as if no one had seen her crumple. "I knew it was a processing error," she said, smoothing her dress. Come." The Hartwells moved through the gala like survivors of a shipwreck moving through a crowded beach, surrounded by people who were otherwise occupied. Former friends found sudden reasons to face the other direction. Business contacts became deeply interested in their phone screens. Margaret approached two women she had known for 15 years and received the Charleston version of a cold shoulder. A gracious, warmly worded dismissal delivered with a smile that committed to nothing. They were surrounded by 300 people and entirely alone. Richard found Beaumont Calvert near the bar, a tall, silver-haired man with the unhurried confidence of someone who has not needed to pursue anything in a long time. "Beaumont." Edward extended his hand. "Richard. Edward Hartwell. We spoke last spring about the North Atlantic route." Calvert shook the hand. He looked at Edward. He looked at the faint sweat on Carter's collar. "Hartwell, yes. I've been wondering if I'd see you here." "We're ready to move forward," Edward said, pulling a card from his pocket. "We can undercut the competition on the coastal rate by 12%. We just need a bridge investment to restart the fleet. We've restructured the operational side completely." Calvert didn't take the card. He looked past Edward toward the pavilion, where Vivian was visible near the center of the room, laughing at something James had said. The brooch caught the light from across the room. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Edward," Calvert said, his voice dropping to something conversational and final. "I finalized a partnership agreement with the Voss Trust 3 weeks ago. New shipping subsidiary. Vivian's people are managing the build-out. As part of that agreement, our partners adhere to a conduct standard." He looked at Margaret. "You don't meet it. What you did to that young woman, oh, what a day. I wouldn't trust you to move a filing cabinet, let alone a cargo manifest. Good evening." He stepped around them. He was already looking at someone else. The finality of it was physical. It wasn't a closed door. It was a sealed one. Security appeared at Edward's elbow a moment later. Polite, immovable. "Mr. Hartwell, your standing access has expired. I'll need to ask you to make your way to the exit. If you've been listening to this story, you already know what's coming. But go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. The next one is just as sharp." At the walk back to the parking area was the longest 200 yards of their lives. The music from the pavilion faded behind them as they moved out of the light and into the warm June dark. The live oaks were still lit. The air still smelled of jasmine. None of it was theirs in the way it had once felt theirs. At the edge of the parking area, Edward looked at his phone. "Surge pricing," he said. $60 to the apartment." "We have 35 on the card," Carter said. "Then we wait for the surge to drop," Margaret said. "It doesn't drop on gala nights," Carter said. "Not until after midnight." There was a long pause. "We walked to the bus stop," Edward said finally. He said it the way a man says something he's needed to say for a long time, but has only now run out of alternatives. They started walking. Back inside the pavilion, Vivian stood at the balcony rail with her wine and watched the 3 figures cross the far edge of the lit grounds and disappear into the dark. She watched until they were gone. She did not feel triumphant. She felt strangely very clear. The way the air feels after a long storm finally passes and everything is washed and the light comes back different. "You're quiet," James observed. "I'm thinking about accountability," she said. "Not revenge. There's a difference. Is there a distinction that matters tonight?" "Yes. Revenge would be me enjoying what just happened to them. Accountability is... She paused. It's them living inside the consequences of their own decisions. That's different. I didn't architect their downfall. They did. I just stopped absorbing it. She turned from the balcony. Inside, the orchestra was shifting tempo, something warm and moving, the kind of peace that invites the floor to fill. "James," she said, handing him her glass. "Yes." "I want to dance." He laughed. The full one, not the small professional one. He offered his arm. Vivienne Voss walked back into the light. If this story moved you, and I think it did, let me know in the comments. Did Vivienne handle the ending right? Was Carter a lost cause, or did he earn some mercy? I want to hear where you land. They say that dignity, once taken from you, cannot simply be handed back. You have to go get it. Vivienne Voss did not recover her dignity by inheriting a land trust or by serving a legal notice in a mahogany boardroom. Thus, she recovered it the moment she climbed over that iron gate in the rain and dialed the number, the moment she chose to stop accepting less than what she was worth. The Hartwells had spent 30 years believing that power was something you kept by taking it from other people, by controlling the allowance, the seating chart, the coat closet. They believed that because Vivienne was quiet, she was empty. They believed that because she was kind, she had no teeth. They were wrong on both counts. Windermere today operates as the Voss Coastal Archive and Learning Center, an education facility that provides access to rare books, primary source documents, and literacy programs to low-income students across the Lowcountry. The live oak alley that once led to a locked iron gate is open on Saturdays. Children run up it. There are picnic tables near the river. Stephen still manages the house. He got a significant raise and a car. As for the Hartwells, Edward eventually found consulting work for a small regional freight firm. Margaret began teaching etiquette classes to debutante families. She has not been photographed at a notable social event in 4 years. Diana is selling real estate in a mid-sized coastal city and is, by several accounts, considerably more pleasant to deal with than she used to be. Carter. Hartwell still works logistics in Mount Pleasant. He does not have a trust fund, an estate, or a famous last name. He has a small apartment, a truck, and a job that asks something real of him every day. And by every account, he is the only one in his family who has actually changed. Some people get what they deserve. Some people get something better than that. They get a chance to become someone worth deserving things. The quietest people, Vivienne once told a group of school children sitting on the floor of the old Windermere Library, often carry the longest histories. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room. You just have to know what you're holding, and if you've been holding out on that subscribe button, now's the time. Next week, a self-made woman discovers her business partner has been selling her company one piece at a time. And she's been signing the paperwork. You are not ready.